Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is Sonship Establishment Part 4, and this is session, it's actually going to be 17 and 18 is what it's going to be. I'm not sure. We did so many of them, and I kind of conglomerated them together. It's toward the end. Okay. Romans chapter 11, if you'll turn there in your Bible, and we're going to read a large passage of Scripture, and then we're going to talk out of this passage just like we did in the previous session. Romans chapter 11, and we're going to start reading at verse 16. Now remember, we've taken up right where we have left off, that stumbling, fall, diminishing, and fullness of Israel. Now, verse 16, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, this goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise, thou also shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? All right, now, with that being read, that's as far as we need to go, because we're not going to have time to take this any further, but we'll be exactly where we need to be if I can get this done. There's a whole scheme here that started with 4 issues, and that was the first fruit, and the lump, and the root, and the branches. And the issue was, if the first fruit be holy, the lump is holy. And if the root be holy, then the branches are holy. Now, just keep in your mind what it means for something to be holy. Holy does not mean righteous. Remember, the vessels in the temple were holy. It wasn't because that was a righteous cup, and it was just doing good things. Holy means set apart. And remember, in your sanctification, you are the holiness of God in Jesus Christ. Remember, in your justification, you're the righteousness of God in Jesus Christ. In your sanctification, you're the holiness of God in Jesus Christ. Remember that? Okay. And so, and by the way, later on, you'll be the glory of God in Jesus Christ. We'll talk about that. But anyway, this is an issue of your sanctification, or your being set apart. Now, as we were going down through this, there was something that I wanted to make mention of. Let me just glance at this passage one more time. I don't want to just get it out of order. I'm not going to be able to think of it. I thought it when I read it, and I'm not going to. All right. I want to talk about this, because when you go back to first fruit, almost everybody realizes that in the law, God set aside certain days to be observed in a very particular way. There was a set of those days that were called feast days. The Feast of First Fruits was one of those feast days. It was one of those 3 days when all of Israel was to come into Jerusalem and celebrate that feast corporately. Remember, Pentecost was another one of those days, on that day when the Spirit came, and there was a testimony made to Jews that were from all over the world. Well, now you have first fruit. Now, I'm not going to take you through all of these verses, and I could have, in fact, I actually thought maybe I put them in here, and if I did, maybe we just turn there and look at them real quickly. I guess I did, Leviticus 23. And we'll stay in this chapter for just a while. Leviticus chapter 23, and I want to just show you a series of verses to substantiate the foundation that I'm laying right here to make the comments that I am. In Leviticus 23:1, all I'm going to show you is that God set apart these particular days as holy. And they were holy because they were set apart and to be observed every year because they were telling Israel something that God did not want them to forget about. They needed to keep it in their memory, so they rehearsed it every year. Leviticus 23:1, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, concerning the feast of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations. That's the part I'm after. Even these are my feasts. The only part I'm after there is that from the very beginning, when the Lord ordained these days, they are to be holy convocations. All right? Now, Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 10. We'll see the first fruits as one of these. I know you already know it. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. Now, that's as far as you want to read for that. Now, you already knew that first fruit was one of those, but there's another point I want to make out of this, and he says, when you be come into the land which I give unto you. Understand this, that the law was given to the nation of Israel to practice inside the promised land. They were given that law back at Sinai, and how long did they wander before they went into the 40 years? Did they practice that Feast of First Fruits during that time? The answer is no, because the command was when you go into the land, that's when you're going to do that. Now, it's really odd to me is that there's a bunch of folks that want to integrate the law and all the things, especially the feast days, into what they're doing today. Funny to me, they're doing it in the dispensation of grace and not in Israel's program. Funny to me, they're doing it when they didn't have a crop. And it's funny to me that they're doing it outside the land. At the end, you couldn't get it more wrong. But there it is. All right, now, in connection with the Feast of First Fruits, there were two offerings. Now, I'm just going to talk about these quickly because we could spend the next 2 Tuesdays talking about this, and we're not. There is a wave offering and a heave offering. Now, let me explain to you what these were. When the first fruit came in, there was something that was produced from the harvest of that first fruit. And when that thing was produced, in this particular case we're going to look at, it was 2 loaves. It doesn't matter if it was wheat or whatever it is. You take that harvest, and then from that harvest you'd put together a lump of dough, and from that lump of dough then you'd create 2 loaves. You'd bake them in an oven, and when those were baked in the oven, they were brought to the temple or tabernacle, depending on what they were using, and they were given to the priest. And what the priest would do is he would take those before the Lord, and it's called a wave offering because he would do just that. He would wave those back and forth before the Lord. And that was the sign that he had done exactly what that holy convocation had called for him to do. Now, out of the wave offering, there was another offering called the heave offering. And that heave offering was done just like you think. It was lifted up or heaved before the Lord as a single line, a single direct line indicating consecration, set apartness to God. Now, these 2 offerings actually went to support the Levites. Remember, in the land, they weren't given a plot of ground, so they couldn't have a harvest. They couldn't do those. They couldn't raise cattle. So what they did is they would bring these offerings in, and they would wave them before the Lord, and then the priest would eat them. Okay, I'm kidding. I mean, it didn't have exactly like that, but you know what I'm saying. That was for him. As a matter of fact, you remember over in Malachi where God says, you have robbed me in tithes and offerings? It was these 2 that were really heavily in view because the people got to thinking, you know what, I mean, we've done these other things to the Lord, and this stuff is just for the Levites, and you know what, we can kind of chintz out on that. And when they did, God said, you know what, you robbed me. That's why he's saying me, because they looked at that like, well, that doesn't go to God, so it doesn't count. But it was part of what he commanded. All right, get off of that. So you have the wave offering and the heave offering. The only other thing I'll tell you about that is this was part of this. When an animal was being a part of a wave offering, you couldn't pick up a whole bullock and wave him before the Lord. So what they did is they usually took that right breast area, and that was the wave offering, and then they would take and it was always the right side, then they'd take the right shoulder, and that was part of the wave offering, and that heave offering then just became that smaller part. All right, and I just say that to say that's what these things were done, and these offerings were done in conjunction with first fruit. Now, who is it that declared those feast days to be holy? God did. So there is, down here at the bottom of all of this, and I'm going to do this for a reason, at the root of everything that's going on here, God had decided there was something that He was doing, and I'll complete this in just a moment, but He said this first fruit, this is one of those days that is a holy convocation. And He says, if the first fruit be holy, the lump is holy. Well, I have to tell you, I kind of ran myself in a circle here because I went back into the first 5 books of the Bible, didn't have any trouble finding first fruit at all, but I looked for the word lump. And by the way, you understand what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here, and I know this doesn't look like this, but Bob Summers taught me how to draw like this, so I don't care. So what's happening here is this is a olive tree. And that's what we just read about. Do you recall that? Okay. And so I went back and I looked at first fruit, and I thought, okay, if the first fruit is holy, the lump is holy. I couldn't find the word lump anywhere in those first 5 books. In fact, the word lump only appears in the Old Testament twice. It's in 1 Kings and somewhere after that, and in both places, it's a lump of figs. So it doesn't have anything to do with olives. So I got to looking at that, huh? Well, it doesn't use the word lump for bread. It is that. It is that. It is. But he's saying the lump is the dough. And he's right. It is that. But if you go back and try to find the word lump to talk about that, it's just not in there. And also in those first 5 books, when you go back to find that holy root or branches, it's not there. So you kind of have to say to yourself, what is Paul doing with this? And you have to get this, really you have to get this whole package, and then it starts kind of coming together for you. So what I said a while ago, this is a kind of a complex thing. I'm going to boil this down and make it very basic. So here it is at its core. When God decides to do something, when He sets it apart to be holy, everything that comes from that is also holy because of its source. So He says, if the first fruit is holy, then the lump of dough that is made from that first fruit is holy. Not because of the person who's putting it together, but because it comes from something holy. So from that lump, guess what? You're in Leviticus 23, look in verse 11. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. There's that wave offering, down to verse 17. You shall bring out of your habitation 2 wave loaves of 2 tenths deals. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baken with leaven. They are the first fruits unto the Lord. Now, do you see how all of that terminology, we're talking about? So from the lump, you have 2 loaves. And when you wave those 2 loaves before the Lord, that offering is accepted because it's considered to be holy. Why are the loaves holy? Because the lump is holy. Why is the lump holy? Because the first fruit is holy, and that's what God said to do, right? So Paul now is going to, now that he's established the connection between one holy thing, if it comes from that thing that came from it is also holy, he's going to use that principle to come now and talk about a tree with roots and branches. In fact, he's going to talk about 2 trees. Now, we'll do those in just a moment. But he's going to come along after that and say, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. Now, when you talk about a root and branches, and then, of course, when he talks about an olive tree, you know that he's talking about this kind of tree. Now, my understanding is, and I understand, that you run back over to Jeremiah chapter 11, where it talks about an olive tree over there, and make that tree Israel, I do not believe for one moment that this tree is Israel. You can make that case in Jeremiah. You can make that case in Romans 11. This tree can't be Israel, and I'll tell you why. Because if you make this tree Israel, and this is the mistake that everybody makes, then what you're doing is you are contradicting everything else Paul is about to tell you in Romans chapter 11. Paul never identifies this tree as Israel. He never does. And I'll tell you exactly, in fact, I'll let you tell me what the tree is, and I know that you'll get this right. You just have to follow what I'm about to tell you here. Now, if you go back and look at this passage, and I just need to get this verse in front of me again here, this thing in Romans 16 and onward, here's what you have. In fact, let's just follow it through the verses. If the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. Everybody got that? Okay. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. Right? So, in other words, God is saying, if the root of a thing is holy, then the branches that come from it and find their sustenance from that root, they are holy. Not because they're holy in and of themselves, but because they come from something that is holy or set apart. Okay? Now, verse 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, so God is going to come along and say, okay, there's some branches here that are going to get broken off. And by the way, I meant to point this out at the end of the last session. Paul changes in who he's talking to. He begins to talk to Gentiles, and the they is going to refer back to Israel. I need to show it to you, so let me just back up and get that. Romans 11, I want to back up just a couple of verses, and I just want to show you this so you don't have this nagging in your mind. Romans chapter 11, and if you look back, we're in 16, so I need to back up from there. It's verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, insomuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my office. By the way, that's what Paul was doing by all these things, is magnifying his office, because one of the things that always came under attack was the fact that Paul's apostleship wasn't genuine, and through this, he is magnifying his office. 14, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh. Who is that? That's Israel, okay, and might save some of them. But if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? By the way, I didn't mention this, but you know, if there's a casting away of them and there's a receiving of them, he's going to undo what he did, right? At that point, they won't be in that condition forever. Verse 16. Then he says, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root be holy, so also are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, who's he talking to? Gentiles, and thou being a wild olive tree. Now this is great. Now let's do, any tree, what do you know about any tree that's a wild tree? What does that mean it's a wild tree? It screams a lot, throws its branches around. What? What is it? Thank you. It is not cultivated. It's just out there on its own. So you know what? It's this little scrawny, scraggly. I was thinking about this when I was drawing this in Monahan's. I said, you know what you should think of this tree as? Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. That's what you should have in your mind. And you know what the real enigma about that tree is? When he brings it home, it only has 12 needles on it. And every time it bumps, 60 of them fall off. Have you ever noticed that? I don't understand how that happened. But here's this wild olive tree. It's not cultivated. It's anemic. It's out there on its own. This, you're going to find out by the terminology, this, in fact, it's called at the end a good olive tree. This tree is protected. It's fenced off so deer don't chew on it. It's cultivated. It's watered. It's fertilized. It's pruned back. All the things that need to be done to it to make this tree be the best it can be is being done to it. This thing is just out there on its own. If it doesn't rain, it may just wither up and die. I mean, if something comes along and gnaws on it, it just suffers that. That is who we were. And thou, being a wild olive tree, let me go back to this, 17. and thou, being a wild olive tree, were grafted among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree. Boast not against the branches. That's the end of the sentence. So he's saying, here's what happened. There was this good olive tree. And by the way, God is the one, because of this principle, God is the one who gets this tree going. That is what is at the root of this tree. Because when he says, if the root be holy, so are the branches, here's the idea. This tree, right now, don't worry about what we think it is, but this tree had these branches on it. And we know that these branches was the nation of Israel. And he says, and if the branches are broken off and you're over here, this wild olive tree, are grafted in among them, and you become a partaker of the root. Do you remember what we just read there? What happens now to these scraggly, scrawny branches that are grafted into the cultivated, cared-for tree? They really do thrive, don't they? And because they thrive and they do well, and you know what Paul is picturing here? This is where you Gentiles were. And because I broke off Israel's branches, you guys got grafted in. And now you get to partake of something that's not just out there on its own, but something that God is tending. This is a tree. Now just think with me a moment. And look, I want you to get this right, but there's at least a half a dozen right answers here. There is a particular word, though, that's used in this very passage that I would use to label this tree. But if you were just thinking off the top of your head, without trying to identify that word, what would you think right now this tree would be? True Israel? Okay. Well, okay. But, wait. But if they've fallen, I mean, if the program with them is over, and now God has grafted us Gentiles in, a different program is here. So what? That's okay. I want you to say it. I'm just trying to. I haven't given you enough information, huh? Sons is okay, but we're going a while ago when I said, what would this tree is not what, and you said cultivated, or you may have used a similar word. I'm looking for something after that. If a tree is cultivated, what does that mean? What's happening to it? It's being taken care of. And if it's a hybrid, okay. It runs on corn and gas, okay. And I'm sorry, wrong one. They said the same thing in Monahans. They said hybrid, and I did the same joke, and they didn't laugh either. All right. So this tree is holy. This tree is holy because this is something that God is doing. Now look, just follow me here, because this is the problem I was having. Because everybody told me this tree was Israel. If that's true, do you know what happened? We got grafted into Israel. See, we didn't get grafted into Israel. It is part of his big plan, but I'm going to use the word that this uses, and I'll give you some other words. It is the tree of God's goodness. Well, I think that's a true statement. That's a true statement. But there's another word you could use here, because that's a word that we're going to find twice in this passage. Now, I'll show it to you. You could say, this is the tree. I'm not talking about dispensations here. This is the tree of God's working. He was working with Israel as long as they were in the tree. When he breaks those branches off, he's not working with them anymore. But when he grafts us in, guess what he's now doing? Working with us. And we become the beneficiaries of his goodness. There's another word. What else could we say? Grace, yeah. Right, we're getting mercy and grace. Someone could take that back and say, I will show, Loopy said it, I'll show mercy on whom I'll show mercy, and I'll be gracious to whom I'll be gracious. God can do that with Israel. He can do that with us. I mean, that's all true. Is there any other word you can think of? Sure. He was long-suffering with Israel, and now he is being in fact, the Bible calls us a time of long-suffering and forbearance. Any of those words will work. But now let me call your attention back to the passage. Look with me here. Verse 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. In other words, he's going to warn us. We'll get into the warnings in a minute. Don't be acting like the reason God broke them off and put you in is because you're so good. The only reason you're going to be anything is because you're plugged into a tree that's something. Okay? In fact, he's going to warn you, there's a day coming when these other branches are going to get broken off and put back out there, and he's going to take the natural branches and put them right back in. And guess what? Then Israel will once again become the beneficiaries of God's good cultivating hand that is working with them. Doesn't that make sense? More sense than saying Israel. Because I looked at that and I thought, we did not get grafted into Israel. In fact, that's the whole thing Paul's trying to undo here. And I kept, beating my head against the wall. But, okay, now look at this. Let me take you down to, now I'm skipping some things, but we'll go back. Verse 22. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell. Who was that? Israel. Severity. But toward thee, goodness. And that's why I picked that word. This tree is the tree of God's goodness. Hold your finger there and go back to Romans chapter 2. Because as I was thinking that rang a bell with me. And that took me back to something we have already read before. Because when he was talking about the lost and how God was, what is God doing today? He's dealing with everybody according to his grace, right? He is not imputing men's sins unto them. And an evil, ungodly man today, can he have good health? Have a good job? Make a lot of money? Have friends? Sure, he can have all of that. Because God's not punishing him according to his deeds right now. But when he takes that opportunity and thinks nothing about it, he's doing something. And Paul described it back in Romans chapter 2, verse 4. He says, or despisest thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance, and here's Tommy's word, long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance. He says, you know what? God's being good to you to lead you to repentance. And you know what you're doing? You're despising the goodness of God. Well, that is part of it. That is a part of it. So God has this, and when John said a while ago, this is like everything God is doing is coming through this tree. That's true. This is the tree God's working with. This is the tree God is cultivating and nourishing. And so whichever branch is plugged in, it gets the benefit of the root. See, and so, by the way, if this root is holy or set apart, then whatever branch is plugged in up here is supposed to be set apart. It's supposed to be holy as well, right? So my point is, behold therefore the goodness and severity of God. Severity on them that fell, goodness on thee. But he's going to warn us about thinking, oh, well, see, God thought we were so special. He put us in there and took Israel out. And he's going to say, don't be high-minded, but fear. And I want to talk to you about that fear. In fact, let's back up and look at those. In fact, verse 17, let's read it one more time because I need you to see the statement here. Some of the branches were broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, semicolon, boast not against the branches. Talking about the ones that were broken off. What's boast against mean? It means I'm really good compared to you guys that got broken off. That's the essence of that. The rest of verse 18. But if thou boast, here's what he wants them to remember. Thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. The only reason, I'm going to put it like this. You know why we as Gentiles get salvation today and we talk about these things like we've always been in there? Because the root bears us. Don't get lifted up and thinking you're bearing the root. It's the other way around. By the way, there's a point I want to make here, and I'll elaborate on it at the end, and that is you've never known a day when you weren't in this tree. And we've never known anybody that lived on this earth and saw them face to face and had them describe what it was like to be in the wild olive tree when we were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants and promise, without hope and without God in the world. We have never known what that's like. And we've never known anybody that's, because we've been in this so long. This is all we've ever known. Paul is going to say there is a day coming when these branches are going back and they're going to, Gentiles, listen to this, are going to be reconsigned to the adversary. The natural branches are going back in. Because once the natural branches go back in, is he working with these branches anymore? No, he's going to break them back off and put the natural branches back in. Look, there's two things God is trying to say here by this tree. Number one, well, there's a lot of things, but two main things. One of them is, I have already made a provision to restart Israel's program at some time in the future. That's going to be a done deal. Here's the second thing. It's going to be easier to do that than it was to bring in this thing for Gentiles. You know why? They're the natural branches. Now, I have a question for you. I think that's part of the misleading part. When he says, well, let's just read it here. He says, verse 21, for if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. If people look and say, if they're the natural branches, then the tree, if Israel's the natural branches, then the tree must be Israel. No, the tree is not Israel because the branches are something else. The branches are Israel. That's what he calls them. The reason you know that the tree is not Israel, even though they're the natural, why are they called the natural branches? Okay, he made his covenant with them. They're the chosen ones. Oh, that's right. I need you to take that back one more step. They're the natural branch. Why are they the natural branches and we're not? Because they have never not been in that tree until the dispensation of grace. When God consigned the nations of the world over to the adversary and called Abraham and made an unconditional covenant with him, that nation from the very beginning was smack dab in this tree. That's why they're the natural branches. God never did that with anybody before that. Now he plugs them in, and they're the natural branch because they're the first branch that was ever in that tree. But God said, I got another program that I'm doing, so I'm going to break these branches off. I'm going to put this wild olive tree, I'm going to put them in there because out here in the wild, those things are uncultivated. They're on their own. They're just, they make it, they don't make it. Whatever happens, that's it. But you know what? I got something to do with them. I break these branches off. And by the way, he told you why he broke them off, because of unbelief. They're the reason it happened. But when he breaks that off, he's going to take these branches and put them in. And now we've been in there 2,000 years, and we get to thinking, yeah, we're all that and a bag of chips, right? We're just so good. But he's going to warn us about that. Now I want to go back to the reading again. Verse 19, thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. And you'd be exact. I will say that. Yeah, you would. You would say that, and that'd be right. The branches were broken off that you might be grafted in, because God can't keep both of those branches in the tree at the same time. Verse 20, well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. Now, what is that fear about? It's not about, Well, it's okay. Huh?
With Jesus' death.
Well, that did happen in history. That did, and that's not wrong. But I think there's more there than that. Linda, say that.
We could have unbelief also and be broken off.
We also don't. Well, I think that's right. And I'll look at the next verse. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. Thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded. What does that mean? Okay. But fear, for if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. In other words, don't get to thinking once you're in forever. That is not the case. The part that I think of the fear, I try to set you up with that, was to say we've never known a day. Even a lost man has never known a day when Gentiles weren't plugged into the tree of God's goodness. What will it be like when we are put back out here? Now, I say we, I don't mean we. We're going to, yeah, Francis now thinks I think we lose our salvation. That's okay. No, I'm kidding. We're going to be up there. We'll be sons, but Gentiles. We Gentiles. We'll be back out here. Where were we before? What were we doing religiously? Superstition. Worshiping every god imaginable except the one true God. Under the thumb of the adversary. When this dispensation of grace is over, that's exactly where Gentiles are going back to. Now, we have... Linda? We're there now.
When we're talking about Gentiles in here, and he keeps talking about thou and we and all that. Is he talking sons or is he talking just Gentiles?
Okay, that's a very good point. Did you understand her question? Because the whole context up to this point have been about sons making the cry of Abba Father. And this is part of the establishment of those sons so that they put to rest once and for all who they are in this dispensation of grace and whether or not they're going to be any part of Israel's program, so that when they go into the education, they go in that with the exact mindset that they're supposed to have. And I think Linda is exactly right. That's the very point someone brought up in Monahan's. And so here's the verse I want to take you to with that thought in mind. Look down here in verse 22. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise, thou shalt be cut off. The way this verse gets handled is to say this. I'm going to paraphrase it just the way it's taught. You're going to continue to get God's goodness for as long as God gives you goodness. Now, I looked at that and I thought, why did you even need to say that? That's like saying, son, there's gas in the car, and you'll have gas in the car until there's no more gas. Did you really need to explain it like that? I think this is telling us what Linda is talking. Linda is in Monahan's. What? It is Linda here. Was it Linda in Monahan's? Two Lindas. Wow, I didn't think of that. Sorry. No wonder I was confused. I thought, what do I call her? I've already used Linda. Okay. I was out of names. I don't know. All right. Okay. Hi. Okay, Mrs. Ron. All right. I think what Linda said is right. How long will we I think this is telling us not a years, but how long we're going to be plugged in to this tree. As long as we continue in that goodness. If we decide By the way, at first, you have, when you're sorting all this out, you have the tendency to look at it and go, it's just about Gentiles. But really, when you understand the strict context, it is a Gentile dispensation of grace. But when you understand the context here of those who continue, you know what he's talking about? The word continue implies there has been no break. Right? Which would tell you that from the time of Paul until today, someone has been involved in this. We may not be able to identify them or know who they are, but you can't continue if the thing has been... the word continue wouldn't be right. Resume might be right, but if you continue, it means that you're still going through the process that you have been going through. There is an idea here that as long as we continue in this goodness... Now, let's do that one. What does it mean to continue in His goodness? Because I don't think it just means as long as He's being good to us, we're continuing in His goodness. I think that goes without saying. By the way, in your notes, I pointed out a half a dozen places before we ever got here where that issue got settled. And it got settled in very plain language. You don't have to interpret that out of this. I think here, this if is a conditional clause, just like, if so be that we suffer with Him. I don't think it's another if. I know it's another if. Just look at the wording here. He says, if thou continue in His goodness, otherwise. Well, what's the otherwise in reference to? If you're not going to continue in His goodness. And what happens if you're not going to continue? Otherwise, thou shalt be cut off. So we'll wind up being like the other branches. In other words, there is an indication here, at least I think we ought to consider it, that as long as we continue in the sonship that we've begun here, and we continue in it, then we have an opportunity to continue to be recipients of God's goodness. But look, I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question that you're wanting to ask me, and that is, how close have we come to having this no longer continue in the world? I don't know.
Too, there's one other aspect. Paul writing to them in their day and how it applied to them, most of those people within their lifetimes had seen God cut Israel off. So the fear, don't be high-minded, but fear of God to do the same thing with you, really, most of those believers that were alive then were expecting the day of judgment and wrath to happen within their lifetimes, and those things to happen. So it was a very real possibility that if they did not maintain these things that He was teaching,
they'd be cut off too.
They'd be cut off.
Right. So it was as relevant to them as it would be for us, which gives credence to the very point that we're making here. That if we go under, and other sonship churches go under, and people walk away, if you're God and you have a program that you're trying to see carried out in this dispensation of grace, and that thing has just fell apart, would there be any reason to continue a dispensation? There wouldn't be any reason to do that.
Well, maybe it was the continuance of the grace age rather than us falling out of it.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That first idea is you're in it for as long as that age continues. But that's the point that I'm thinking kind of goes without saying. No matter why it ends, I'm kind of looking at it from the standpoint of saying it the way that he says it, I think indicates, here's the indication of how long you'll be plugged in. Now, I don't deny the truth of that statement. When someone, no matter how they phrase it, and you phrase it a really good way, Trey, I don't deny that. For as long as God continues this dispensation of grace, you'll be in the tree of His good. I don't deny that one bit. I don't think, we heavy argue with that. I think, though, the threat of being cut off if we don't continue isn't about God's timing and cutting it off, but it's about our continuance as opposed to our non-continuance.
If that if is a first-class condition, it means, and this is true, that you will continue in His goodness. Is it a first-class condition?
No, I don't think it's saying that, no. Because I don't think it's setting the stage for a second thing. What she's talking about is, if someone says, are we going to hear about sonship? And I say, if we meet on Tuesday, we're going to hear about sonship. So the second one is just as true. The if isn't maybe it will, maybe it won't, although I didn't give a good illustration there. But a first-class conditional says it's not asking if it will or not. It's saying if this is true, and it is, then this second thing is also just as true. And I don't see the formation of a second thing. I see two opposite things. I see if you continue, you get this. Contrawise, you get that. That to me makes it a conditional.
We have to keep having faith in God's word.
Well, we do. And he says, thou standest by faith.
Some people stop having faith that it's true, then...
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Okay, I only got a couple minutes here, and there's 100 things I want to talk to you about this. Let me just look down through the passage here. We've gotten the high-minded, but fear we could be cut off. Verse 23, and they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again, and He certainly is. For if thou were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted in contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more, or how much easier would it be for these which would be the natural branches to be grafted into their own olive tree? And that was the point I was trying to make. If God can do it with you, and it's not the natural thing to do it with you, don't get to thinking, oh, is God really going to come back and do this thing with Israel? It's way easier for Him to put the natural branches in than it was for Him to take those wild branches and put them in. And that was the point that I made to you a while ago. Now, that's the only point I'm trying to get across to you as far as my talking to you. The notes will have more things than that, but this is, I think, the main thrust of what we're trying to get done. Here's the other point I want to make in the last minute. Do not get to looking at this illustration as though you're supposed to... I know we pick these verses apart and look at every word. I'm not against that, but I'm saying what the Lord is doing here by... Remember, it all got introduced up here. Is making a general statement about the certainty and the ease of resuming His program with Israel. He's not meant for you to start reading a bunch of stuff into what kind of tree this is, because that would be true. What we've just talked about would be true of an apple tree. You see what I'm saying? So I'm saying I don't think He means for us to get bogged down into this, let's determine I think the whole point that He's trying to make was given to us first up in verse 16. He's given you a principle whereby you understand that there's a source, and things that come from that source get the benefit of that source. You and I were grafted in as Gentiles into a tree of God's care, God's grace, God's goodness, God's cultivating hand, God's work, whatever you want to call it. We're grafted into that tree. He is doing that with us. There's a day coming when we're going to get broken out. I see that day as the day when we no longer continue to do this. Now, I said I have one more thing to say to you, and I did have one more, and now I have one more. Okay. And this is the last one. And I hate to tell you this. I do, because this bothers me. And I not only don't like to think about this, I don't like to believe that it's true. I don't like this idea. But I want you to understand how dedicated Satan is to the destruction of groups that are doing what we're doing. So I want you to turn to one place, if you would, and that would be Acts chapter 20. I just want to read a couple of verses here, and I'm just going to tell you about the other verse over in Timothy. Now, we'll talk about that one in a moment. But in Acts chapter 20, Paul is on his way. Remember, we talked about this the last session. Well, maybe we didn't. in Acts 20, Paul is on his way back to Jerusalem to take that offering to the poor saints there at Jerusalem. But he's doing something else. He wants to get there in time for the feast day. And he says there's a reason he wants to get back there, and it concerns the message that he wants to preach to the Jews. He wants to get that message to them. Now, he knows he's going to pay a price, but he's going anyway, and nobody can talk him out of it. They try. In fact, finally they say, and when we see that he could not be persuaded, well, when Paul comes back to Miletus, he doesn't go back to Ephesus. He doesn't take the time, but he sends word and calls for the elders of the church at Ephesus to come and meet him at Miletus, and he gives them one of the saddest talks that anyone could ever get in that day, because Paul meets with them and he says, you're not going to see my face anymore. And he knows there's something waiting for him at Jerusalem that will keep him from ever seeing the Ephesians again. And they're brokenhearted. And they're brokenhearted. In fact, they're weeping and they're putting their arms around his neck. And he says, why meaneth you to break my heart? And he talks to them about what he's got to do. And then he gives them a warning. And I want you to see this warning. Did my glasses here. Acts chapter 20. And I want you to look at verse 17. And from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called for the elders of the church. And when they were come to him, he said unto them, you know from the first day that I came into Asia, after what manner I have been with you at all seasons, serving the Lord with all humility of mind and many tears and temptations which befell me by the lying in wait of the Jews, and how I kept back nothing that was profitable unto you, but have showed you and have taught you publicly and from house to house. Verse 22, and now, behold, I go bound in the Spirit, small case s. It's talking about how Paul feels in his inner man here. I go bound in the Spirit unto Jerusalem, not knowing the things that shall befall me there, save that the Holy Ghost witnesses in every city, saying that bonds and afflictions abide me. So he didn't know every detail, but he did know he was going to go to prison, he was going to be afflicted. Verse 24, but none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy in the ministry which I received of the Lord Jesus Christ, to testify the gospel of the grace of God. And that's what he wants to do when he gets to Jerusalem. Verse 25, and now, behold, I know that ye all, among whom I've gone preaching, the kingdom of God shall see my face no more. Wherefore I take you to record this day that I am pure from the blood of all men, for I have not shunned to declare unto you all the counsel of God. Take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock over which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. And I don't have time to talk to you about that, but you need to look at that word grievous, not just wolves, and that phrase, not sparing the flock. He's not saying, oh, they didn't just come into, the wolves didn't come into the flock to fellowship. No wolves come into the flock to fellowship. But when he says not sparing the flock, what he's talking about is when they get through, there is no flock. The next one, here's the second part of what he knows is going to take place. Also of your own selves shall men arise. And that rise is not talking about they're just going to stand up out of their chair. It means they're going to rise into positions of influence among the assembly. Of your own selves, that means inside that assembly, men shall arise speaking perverse things. Why? To draw away disciples after them. And he says you're going to be attacked from two places. From outside, grievous wolves are going to come in and try to destroy the flock. And then from inside, people are going to rise up and try to pull people out of there to follow them. And here's what he says to Timothy. I want to remind you what we read. You know of what manner I came to you in Asia, and how I taught you, and how I preached. And by the time he writes 4 years later to Timothy, he says this, all those in Asia are turned aside. And that's the Ephesians. Now, I would love to find a way around that. And I don't know that means every single person, because I believe Timothy did what he was supposed to do. But he was the pastor. The reason he writes that to Timothy is he was the pastor of the church at Ephesus. And he warns Timothy about those men from inside his own assembly that are actually going to rise up against him for the purpose of tearing that church apart. That's how dedicated the policy of evil is. And I'm just trying to get it across to you to say that if we don't continue in this goodness, this dispensation of grace is over. He'll break those branches. Yes, we'll be sons. Yes, we'll go to the heavenly places. But He'll break those branches off. He'll plug the natural branches back in, and we're back into Israel's program on this earth, and this thing is done. This is over. And I'm just trying to say the policy of evil is very committed to making that happen. And we need to be ready for that. I'm not just saying words. We better be ready for that. And you better be able to identify it when it happens and know what it is and see it for what it is. I look at that and it breaks my heart to think that the Ephesians who wrapped their arms around Paul's neck and cried their eyes out 4 years later, that assembly was just... And I've already told you before, sonship churches that have started that are no longer in existence, we're not playing church here. If you want this education, you better understand your commitment level to that. You can go back to those 3 commitments we talked about back in orientation. You better remind yourself of those and decide if this is what you want, because nobody's your tutor and governor. If you don't want it, nobody can make you get it. And you're going to have to want it that badly. And I am prepared to lose every ministry I am involved in over this issue, because I know that is a very real possibility. I don't want it to be. And I'm going to do everything in my power to keep it from being that. But I have to tell you, when I see the likes of Timothy and the Ephesians suffering that kind of onslaught of attack, it scares me to death. Because I ain't no Timothy. I know y'all ain't no Ephesians. No, I'm kidding. I'm just being funny. That was not a very good way to do that, was it? Well, not yet. We're on our way. But look, listen, you understand what I'm saying? I need to talk about it and I can't. All right, let's have prayer. We'll be done. You can read it in the notes. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. And I hate to do this, to end our sessions on kind of a down note. But I want us to be reminded and gripped once again with the dedicated attack that is going to come against us from our adversary. We just don't use those terms lightly. We are engaged in a warfare. And although we realize the good things that we're looking forward to, I don't know how much we appreciate what the policy of evil is willing to do to make us quit. I wish, Father, there was some way that I could see how that did not affect what Paul said to Timothy wasn't true of the Ephesians. But I know that there's got to have been a continuance, that someone somewhere kept going with this. And here we are today. And I pray that we would really have this word effectually work in us so that we could say what Paul said, that we don't even count our lives dear unto ourselves for the sake of the work that we're involved in on your behalf. And Lord, I know that we need doctrine to be able to really say that the way Paul said, and we'll get that. And I pray for its effectual working to that end. Thank you for these folks that come so faithfully. And I pray, Lord, that you'd grip us with